So Module 6 will take us through the general anatomy as well as the physiology of the nervous system. So recall from Module 1 that we have two organ systems in the human body that function in communication. The first was the nervous system, and the second was the endocrine system. The nervous system uses electrochemical signals to rapidly communicate directly with other cells and organs. In contrast, the endocrine system makes use of a series of glands that are collectively called the endocrine glands, and they release chemical messengers called hormones into the bloodstream, and then it's the bloodstream that will carry the hormones to their target cells or tissues. And so in this way, the endocrine system is using a more indirect approach in its signaling. So let's examine how both of these systems work. So the nervous system is a rapid signaling system because the signaling cells, which are called the neurons, will create electrochemical signals that can rapidly transmit information to the target cells that the nervous system is communicating with, and then stimulate those cells or tissues to respond. They are rapid because the nervous system can be stimulated, and then the target cell or tissue can respond within a few thousandths of a second. The electrical signals that the nervous system creates are called action potentials, and they travel down neuron structures called axons. And these action potentials will cause the release of chemicals called neurotransmitters from the end of that axon. The neurotransmitter will then stimulate or influence the cell or tissue that's at the receiving end of that axon. Signaling in the nervous system tends to be very short in duration because as soon as that neurotransmitter stops being released from the neuron, the receiving cell will no longer be influenced by it. On the other hand, the endocrine system, as we saw a few moments ago, is a collection of glands that are called the endocrine glands, and these glands release chemical messengers called hormones into the bloodstream. The endocrine system is much slower to communicate, that is on the order or magnitude of several minutes to several hours, with other cells and organs because the hormones have to be moved by the blood to their target cells or their target organs. So it's that indirect approach that we talked about. However, once the target cells receive the hormone signal and then are stimulated or activated by it, the endocrine system effects are much longer lasting than the nervous system because of the way that the chemical messengers, the hormones, are received and then activate the cells that they're designed to activate. So as stated previously, the nervous system creates two types of signals. It creates an electrical and a chemical signal. And so for that reason, we say that the nervous system creates electrochemical signals that stimulate the cells or tissues that it is communicating with. The electrical signals of the nervous system, as we just saw a moment ago, are called the action potentials. And these action potentials cause the release of neurotransmitters from that particular neuron. And the neurotransmitters are the chemical part of signaling in the nervous system. And so we see that the nervous system does use chemical messengers, very similar to the endocrine system. However, it just goes about using them in a slightly different way. The neurotransmitter chemical signals are necessary because the action potential does not cross the small fluid-filled gap that exists between the signaling cell, so in this diagram, that signaling cell is shown on the left, and the target cell, which is located on the right. And so neurotransmitter chemicals are necessary to travel travel across that small fluid-filled gap and signal the receiving or target cell. So notice that the target cell on the right has receptors for that specific neurotransmitter. And so when that specific neurotransmitter binds, that will create a very specific response in that target cell. Additionally, there are also enzymes that are present in that small fluid-filled space that function to destroy the neurotransmitter, which will very quickly end the signaling once the neurotransmitter stops being released from the axon that is releasing it. The nervous system has two anatomical subdivisions. We have the central nervous system, which is shown here in magenta, and that includes the structures that are found within the brain and within the spinal cord. The second anatomical subdivision is the peripheral nervous system, which is shown here in blue, and it includes all the nervous system structures that are found outside of the brain and outside of the spinal cord. And these structures are the nerves, the sensory receptors, and the ganglia. So let's discuss those peripheral nervous system structures for just a moment. The nerves are the cord-like bundles of neuron axons, and these nerves will transmit information to and from the central nervous system. So you can kind of think of the neuron axons as the individual little fibers in the nerve bundle, and each of those neuron axons will sometimes carry different types of information to or from the central nervous system through the nerve. So they will transmit sensory information to the central nervous system, or they will also transmit information away from the central nervous system by sending commands to things like muscles or glands. So you can think of the nerves as the wires that are transmitting information to and from the central nervous system. Sensory receptors are the structures that are specialized to detect specific stimuli. And these are associated with sensory nerves that will transmit this information to the central nervous system, and then it'll be the central nervous system's job to interpret and then decide an appropriate response to that sensory information. And finally, we have ganglia, and ganglia are clusters of neuron cell bodies that are often seen as small swellings in the nerves. And typically, neurons will make connections with other neurons at the ganglia. So typically what we see are neuron axons that are making connections, or what we call synapses, with neuron cell bodies, or I should say other neuron cell bodies in that ganglia. So in addition to the anatomical subdivisions, the nervous system, in particular the peripheral nervous system, also has some functional subdivisions. So the central nervous system functions primarily in a function called integration, which we will discuss what that implies shortly. The peripheral nervous system, on the other hand, is subdivided into the sensory functions and the motor functions. You can also call these the sensory pathways and the motor pathways. So let's examine these three functions now. So the three functional subdivisions of the nervous system, or the three functional divisions of the nervous system, are the sensory input function, the integration function, and the motor output function. So let's begin with sensory input. We see that the body has many different types of sensory receptors that are specialized to detect specific stimuli or changes that are occurring either inside of the body or changes that are occurring outside of the body. This sensory information is then sent to the central nervous system. And typically how this works is that a sensory receptor will be stimulated by a specific stimulus. For instance, the sensory receptors that are in the retina of our eyes are specialized for detecting light as well as color, and so these will detect visual information. The lamellar corpuscles that we examined back in the integumentary system module are specialized for sensing pressure as well as vibrations on the skin. Both of these example receptors, as well as any other receptors that are found in the body, are generally associated with sensory neurons, and those sensory neurons will transmit that information to the central nervous system. And that's where the central nervous system will perform its function of integration. And integration is the job of the central nervous system to process and interpret the sensory information that is coming to it. The central nervous system will then decide how to appropriately respond to that sensory information using both the sensory input that it is currently receiving, as well as any relevant past or relevant learned experience in order to shape or modify the response that's being carried out by the body. And finally, we have motor output, which is the third function of the nervous system. And this is where the nervous system will activate structures called effector organs that will carry out the body's response to that particular stimulus. Effector organs could be muscles or they could be glands, and these muscles or glands will change what the body is doing in response to that particular stimulus.